Hi friends, I'm Stacy and welcome to my channel. Today we are going to talk about a bunch of books, I didn't count how many, a bunch of books that are just some of my favorite books of all time. The puppy wanted to come say hi. The puppy wanted to come say hi. Hi, hi, hi. I want to apologize for the lighting. There's like a weird hazy thing going on over here. This is not like ideal lighting. But I have to film this now because the baby's napping. And I want to get this filmed so I can get it edited and uploaded, so we're dealing with it. Before we get into the actual favorite books, I had so many more and I found it kind of hard to like narrow down. So we're going to talk about some honorable mentions first. I tried to narrow it down a little, so the ones that I'm going to talk a little more about are ones that I feel like are maybe a little more underrated, that maybe you wouldn't have heard of as much. And some of my other favorites are like super hyped, super not overrated. I don't want to say overrated, but they're very hyped books that you've probably heard of before. So I don't need to go on and on about them more, essentially. So let's go through those really quickly first, and then we'll get to the rest of the books. So my honorable mentions. First of all, we've got to talk about the Harry Potter series, guys. Okay, I know, J.K. Rowling is a trash person. I fully acknowledge that. We do not support transphobic and homophobic behavior. However, these books are just really, really nostalgic for me. I believe that you can still enjoy this world that she's created and these characters that she's created while still not being a transphobic, horrible person. So anyway, I still will continue to reread these books. It is what it is. Next we have The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first Mistborn book. I've only read this first book. This is actually the only Brandon Sanderson that I have read. However, Brandon Sanderson is an amazing, amazing writer. I found this to be a very, very fast-paced fantasy book, and I really, really loved it, and I really need to continue on at some point. Happy Place by Emily Henry. Emily Henry is, at this point, an auto-buy romance author for me, which doesn't happen very often. I don't buy a ton of new books, but Emily Henry. I have Funny Story on my shelf waiting to be read, and Happy Place is my favorite so far of all of her books. I know that people are a little like hot and cold on her. They like kind of love some of her books and don't like some of her other books. I personally have liked all of them. Book Lovers was probably my least favorite of hers so far, at least of her romance books. This one was by far my favorite. The Illuminae Files trilogy. I have talked about this before. I actually recently reread Gemina not that long ago, and plan to hopefully reread Obsidio, also the third book in this. This is a sci-fi, YA sci-fi that's mixed media, and it's just a fun time. Some other books that I don't have physical copies of, we have The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This is, of course, a historical fiction, World War II historical fiction. It's a beautiful, beautiful story, but everybody knows that. A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Bachman. This is a contemporary about an older man whose neighbors kind of like forcefully try to befriend him, and he tries to resist very, very much. We have One of Us Is Lying by Karen McManus. This is like The Breakfast Club, but like somebody gets killed. We have Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Actually, Crooked Kingdom is my favorite of her books that I've read so far. But I just put Six of Crows because it's the first in the duology, and I much preferred the Six of Crows duology to the first trilogy, the Shadow and Bone trilogy. But it's just a fun like YA fantasy heist situation. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Absolutely love this book. I really need to read The Starless Sea by her. I've just been putting it off for reasons that I couldn't really tell you. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a contemporary fiction about a band in the 70s who breaks up, and it's just kind of interviewing the people who were in the band and trying to figure out why they broke up. And then of course we have Legends of Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a beautiful, beautiful, fun, cozy fantasy. I also loved Bookshops and Bone Dust, the second book, or it's kind of a prequel story, I guess, but also a really, really beautiful story. All right, now on to the ones that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. I do have quite a few books to talk about, so I'm going to try to like be quick about it. I tend to get a little too chatty, but we're going to try to be fast. We do have kind of a wide variety of genres here. I read a lot of different genres, so I've kind of loosely tried to group it by genre. So first we have historical fiction. The first one here I have is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaefer. This is a epistolary novel, which means it's told in letters, and it's letters between a woman living on the island of Guernsey off the coast of England and a man who I believe is in London, and he finds her address in a book and he writes to her and they end up writing back and forth. Hi, editing Stacy popping in here really quickly. I actually got this mixed up. So the woman actually lives in London and the man lives on the island of Guernsey. So I got it swapped around. But the rest of it still stands. Still a really good book. It takes place during I believe it's World War II, when the island is inhabited by the Germans, and these people are getting together to try to figure out how to basically rebel against the Germans, and they have to pretend to be part of a book club so that they don't attract negative attention from the Germans. And there's also a little bit of a love story. It's just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. I believe there's a movie too. So, and unfortunately this author actually passed away either before the book actually got published or shortly after it got published. So unfortunately this is the only book that we get from her, but it was a beautiful, beautiful story. Next we have Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, not 100% sure how to pronounce that. This is about a woman who accidentally goes through standing stones, like Stonehenge-ish kind of situation, but it's not Stonehenge, and ends up in like the 1700s during the war between Scotland and England. And she ends up kind of having to marry a man there in order to protect herself because she's English, and she ends up in Scotland and they think that she's a spy, so she has to marry Jamie to protect herself, and she ends up falling in love with him. But she also just has kind of, they find her knowledge suspicious because she's from the future, so she knows a lot of things that they think she shouldn't know, and she's also very knowledgeable about like herbs, and she's a nurse in her own time, and so she tries to help heal people, and some of the things that she does to heal people strike up the suspicions of the people, and she ends up getting accused of witchcraft, essentially. There are some, listen, I love Claire and Jamie so much. I love them so much. However, I will tell you guys, you can just read this book as a standalone. There are like 10 books. I think there are 9 books currently out. I haven't read the 9th one. But you can just read this one as a standalone and just be happy with the end of it and just kind of move on with your life. Because Diana Gabaldon likes to She reminds me a little bit of Stephen King, where she just really likes to read her own words, and sometimes her editor just lets her do whatever she wants when really she should be edited down. Some of the later books in the series, they're over here. Some of the later books in the series are like 1,200 pages long. And sometimes not all that much happens in them. They're just kind of, it's just kind of Jamie and Claire living their everyday life. Some of them do have a lot more action. I would say books sort of like 2, 3, and 4, I remember really not enjoying that much. They were kind of a slog to get through, and then like the later books start to pick up a little bit again with the plot, but you really can just read this first book and just pretend that the way that this one ends is the end of it. A lot does happen. It kind of spans Jamie and Claire's like entire life, but you don't have to continue on with the series. But anyway, for children's books, we have The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is the story. I guess it's technically like middle grade. It's not really like a children's book. It's much longer than a children's book. This is a children's classic about a young girl named Mary whose parents die. Her father, I believe, is like an officer in like British occupied India, and that sort of during that time period. And her parents die in an earthquake, and she ends up being sent to live with her uncle at Misselthwaite Manor. And he's a very, her aunt has passed away, and he's just a very like grumpy, like emotionally damaged man. And she ends up making friends with her cousin Colin, who's kind of sickly and hasn't been in great health. And they end up together finding a locked garden with like a locked wall around it. And they bring the garden back to life and dig in the dirt and grow plants and bring some beauty to the world. And it's just a really beautiful story about friendship and what you can do with your own two hands if you're just willing to get a little dirty. And I just love the idea of, you know, getting your hands in the earth and growing something and seeing the fruits of your labors. And it's just a really, really beautiful story. For some YA, for YA fantasy, we have The Bone Houses by Emily Lloyd Jones. This was a surprise for me. I got this in an owl crate, I'm pretty sure, and I honestly, like, this cover did not pull me in. I was not, like, super intrigued by it, but I read it, and I was so surprised by how good it was. I was so surprised. So this is about Rin, and basically in, like, the village that she lives in, her father has taught her about the bone houses, which are essentially like zombies that live in the woods near their village. And I think her father's died. Yeah, both of their parents are dead. So Rin is this caretaker for her younger siblings, and things are just getting kind of hard to deal with. And the bone houses that live in the forest seem to be waking up and getting worse. I don't know. They just seem to be getting bolder, maybe is the word. And she meets Ellis, who is a map maker, and together they decide that they're going to go try to figure out how they can essentially kind of like end the curse of the bone houses or something like that. It's been a long time since I read this. I really probably should reread it. But one thing that I really loved about this is there's a little bit of a love story between Rin and Ellis. Ellis has a physical disability. I don't remember exactly what it is, but I know that he has a physical disability, and he is the sweetest cinnamon roll boy that you ever met in your life. And so it's a little bit of a reverse of the typical, like, what happens in a YA fantasy, or like a YA, like, or any, like, fantasy romance, really, because, like, Rin is, like, a badass. She's strong. And Ellis is this sweet little cinnamon roll who can't wield a sword to save his life. And so Rin kind of has to be the one who's protecting him. And he doesn't let that, he doesn't let himself feel emasculated by that. He lets her protect him and is like, awesome, thanks for that. And I felt like it was a really good dynamic between the two of them. And it also has a lot to say, like, without getting too much into it, because I don't want to spoil things, obviously, it just has a lot to say about grief. And it just has it's a really interesting take on, like, a kind of a zombie story, because essentially these bone houses are technically zombies. But it's a really interesting twist on that story. I know that she has other books too. I probably should look into her other books too, because I really loved this book. For some YA contemporary. Now, I will say, I don't always get along very well with YA contemporary, okay? We don't always do so well. I didn't have a great, like, high school experience. And so sometimes going back to that and dealing with these teenagers who are having a lot of anxiety and dealing with a lot of issues, sometimes it's just not something that I really want to read about. However, sometimes, once in a while, a YA contemporary really hits for me. And it happens. And these are two of those. One, we have Am I Normal Yet by Holly Bourne. This is actually an Australian author. I believe that I think it was kind of hard for me to find this because it's not published in America. But I found it. And I really, really loved it. This is about Evie, who I believe she has OCD, and she's actually been, ended up being hospitalized for this. And has gone through treatment, has gone through a lot of therapy, is doing much better mentally. And she ends up going to a new high school because everyone at her old high school knows what happened to her and she feels like she's the crazy girl. So she goes to, like, a new high school to sort of get to sort of have a new start, essentially. And we end up following her as she makes friends with these other two girls. And it's just her kind of trying to feel normal again and just feel like a normal teenage girl. I will say that this was a pretty heavy read, so trigger warnings for that. This is the first book in a trilogy. The other two books follow, I think there's a little bit of a romance in here too, if I'm remembering correctly. The other two books follow her friends Amber and Lottie. They're How Hard Can Love Be and What's a Girl Gotta Do. I will say I did not enjoy either of the other two books nearly as much as I enjoyed this first book. But maybe I was just in the wrong headspace. I did read this quite a long time ago, and so I will say that my attempts to try to read YA contemporary more recently have not gone as well, and so I don't know if I tried to reread this today if I would still enjoy it as much, but it's a book that I remember really, really enjoying at the time that I read it. Another YA contemporary that I really remember loving it when I read it was Eliza and Her Monsters. I can't remember the author of this one, but a picture of the book will be on the screen. And I actually should have looked it up again before I filmed this, but I do not 100% remember the synopsis of this one because, again, it was a while ago that I read it. All right, well, the puppy was playing with something very loudly and woke the baby up. So now we have a baby. I was hoping he would go back to sleep. He doesn't appear to be. I need to finish filming this video, so we're just gonna live with it. It's just gonna be fine. Anyway, Eliza and Her Monsters. I'm pretty sure, if I remember right, Eliza writes webcomics, and she meets a boy at school who is, like, really active in the like either community surrounding her webcomic, and is, like, a really huge fan of her webcomics. I believe also either she or he, or possibly both of them, also deal with a lot of anxiety and are, like, crippling introverts. And they end up just kind of, like, finding each other and becoming friends, and I believe they have, like, a romance also. Also, some heavy mental health stuff. Can you tell that I I do appreciate that in a YA contemporary. Any sort of like light, fluffy, happy YA contemporary that I've ever tried to read, I didn't enjoy. But if we cover some really heavy topics, I'm here for it. Another honorable mention that I actually just thought of that I didn't mention at the beginning is Eleanor and Park by Rainbow Rowell, and also Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. Those are both YA contemporaries that have a little bit of romance in them and do also deal with some pretty heavy topics, some pretty heavy mental health topics. Freaking dog has been gone with my husband all day. You would think he would be exhausted and would be sleeping, but no, he's like crazier than ever. Anyway, moving on to some just general contemporary. My only one that I have for this is The Traveling Cat Chronicles. Again, I do not remember the author's name, and even if I did, I probably would absolutely butcher the pronunciation of it, so it's probably best that I don't try. But I will have it up here. This is such a beautiful story. It's very short. It made me cry so much. This is essentially about a man who... I'm trying to think how much the synopsis actually says. A man who's trying to rehome his cat for reasons that I don't think we learn until like almost the end of the book, so I don't want to say too much. We're following the cat's point of view as he is temporarily rehomed for a trial period with some of this man's friends to see how things go. And it's just, it's such a beautiful story. It's so sad. It's just gonna make you want to hug all of your cats. It's such a beautiful story about the relationship between animals and their humans. Moving on to some adult fantasy. Fantasy is honestly like my favorite genre, so why I don't have like a million books to talk about in this category, I don't know, but I mainly just didn't want to be here all day. So I picked one book to talk about, and that is Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the first book in, I don't know what this trilogy is called. But anyway, it's the first book in a trilogy, and it is about Sancha? I think her name is Sancha, if I remember right. I think that's how you pronounce it. And she is a teenage girl. She is a thief. She has a very special magical ability, which helps her. And she is sent to, unbeknownst to her, she's hired for a job to go steal a very, very important artifact. And everything just kind of goes from there. She realizes what she has and what this artifact is, and realizes that maybe she shouldn't give it to the people who want it. And we just kind of go from there. This book, man... This entire book was so fast-paced that it felt like the last, 100 pages of any other book. Like, we just hit the ground running, and you're just going the whole time. It's just so fast-paced, you do not want to put it down. There's no build-up, there's no taking some time for world building, and taking time to get to know the characters. You're just thrown into the story, and you just gotta hang on and follow along. And some people, I guess, maybe wouldn't like that, but I promise that if you hang on and follow along, you will love it. There's a really interesting magic system in here where it's basically kind of based on, sort of runes. You kind of, write runes on stuff, and it gives the thing sort of magical abilities, essentially. It's just a really interesting thing. There's also a very fun, almost AI element. I would definitely say this is it's fantasy, but it's also a little sci-fi. There's a little steampunky sci-fi elements to it also. And there's almost kind of an AI character who's so much fun. I will tell you, however, in my professional opinion, I would, again, like I told you with Outlander, to just read the first book and not continue on with the series. Tell you a similar thing with this one. I really liked this one. I gave this one 5 stars. And then Shorefall, which was the second book, I believe I also gave the second one 5 stars. I might not have liked the second one quite as much as the first one. The dog is playing with something again, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. But I DNF'd the 3rd book in this series. So I would just read the first 2 and not bother with the 3rd one. The 3rd one, there's like quite a big time jump between the 2nd book and the 3rd book. And we just end up, the 3rd book just feels like it was a different book by a different author that was part of a different series. It just really doesn't have the same tone at all. It doesn't have the same vibe at all. The characters don't feel like the same characters to me, and I just was not vibing with it, so I DNF'd it. But to each their own. If you have read the entire trilogy and actually liked the 3rd book, let me know. Also, if you've read The Tainted Cup, is it anything like Foundryside? If you've also read Foundryside, let me know. And then finally, I decided to throw in a classic. I do like the odd classic here and there. It's actually been a while since I've read a classic. I used to read a lot more classics, and I've kind of, as I've gotten older, I've sort of lost my attention span for them, I guess. But my favorite classic that I have read in recent years, or actually a long time ago, because I read this probably like 10 years ago, is Emma by Jane Austen. I feel like this is a little bit of a hot take because I feel like this is not one of her most popular books. I feel like a lot of people would say like Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility. But I loved this book, man. Emma is not a super likable character. She's kind of dumb and she makes a lot of poor decisions. But man, does she end up growing at the end of it all. Okay, she sees the error of her ways. She realizes that she's been a terrible friend to her friend. I don't even remember what her name is. Miss Bates. She realizes that she's been a terrible friend in trying to convince her friend to marry somebody who's like has more money and more station than the person that she actually loves. I also really love her relationship with, I don't remember what his name is, but anyway, the guy who she ends up falling in love with in here. I just love that it's kind of like the quintessential sort of like friends to lovers, where they're really friends, and he's really like one of the only people who kind of calls her out on her bullshit and like, you know, but also respects her as a person and, you know, respects what she's trying to do and still cares for her through it all and ends up, you know, of course they end up being in love. Mr. Knightley. I think his name is Mr. Knightley. Anyway, I need to reread this book, or at least watch a movie version of it or something. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. And those were I don't know how many, a bunch of my favorite books that I have read really in my lifetime. Some of these I read a very long time ago, and some of them I read more recently. Probably due for a little bit of a reread for some of them, honestly, if I'm being totally honest with you. I don't really reread books very often, and there's always that kind of worry that you're going to end up rereading a book and end up not loving it as much as you enjoyed it the first time. But anyway, so maybe I should just let the memories live in my mind and not reread them. But either which way, let me know down below if any of these books are also some of your favorite books, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, let me know if you absolutely hated any of these books and why. I'm just curious. I'm always curious to know. It's so interesting sometimes how people have such different opinions of books. I know that I personally have really not liked a lot of very popular books that other people seem to love, so I'm always curious to know people's thoughts on books, even if they don't align with my own. Hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and happy reading. Bye bye, guys.